Okay, so hello everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about engine parasitic load. Now, engine parasitic load is any additional load that the engine is exposed to, limiting its ability to convert energy into motion. Basically, any load that is applied to the engine that causes a burden for it to work efficiently is a parasitic load. And there are two types, inherent and non-inherent parasitic load or parasitic effect. An example of an inherent parasitic load is the fuel pump, the camshaft, and the oil pump, because it requires force to turn the fuel pump for you to have fuel pressure. In the same manner, it requires force to turn the camshaft to actuate the rocker arms pushing down the valves. Also, it requires force to turn the oil pump for the engine to have its necessary oil pressure. But these are considered inherent parasitic load because the engine won't work without these components. But on this video, we are going to focus on non-inherent parasitic load that is applied on the engine, and a typical example is your AC compressor, the alternator, the hydraulic pump, and even including the manual transmission, the axles, etc. When you turn on the AC, the magnetic clutch will activate, turning the compressor. I'll show you, okay? Now watch the clutch engage and observe the engine idle go down, okay? See? I'll disengage. Engage. See, the RPM slows down. Now we will perform the same test using this tachometer, okay? And then we will see how much the RPM goes down. Okay, so right now we have an engine RPM of 960. Should we engage the AC compressor? The engine RPM dropped to 860, okay? Let's disengage. It again came back up to 960. Engage. 860. Okay, so you see the reason why the engine is slowing down, because the AC compressor is having a parasitic effect or parasitic load on the engine, because it requires a lot of energy to turn this compressor, because the output pressure would be more or less 250 psi. Now by comparison, I set this 1/4 horsepower compressor to only 95 psi. This homemade compressor of mine is only up to 110 psi. Now you can just imagine compressing 250 psi. That is why when you turn the AC on, it takes a lot of power from the engine. And that is why in most cases, although this engine doesn't have one, they install an idle up assembly, so that as soon as you turn on your AC, it will turn on the compressor, it will bring the RPM of the engine down, the idle up will bring it up. And that is why they call it idle up. And in so doing, you consume more fuel every time you turn on the AC. Now, the alternator also applies a parasitic effect on the engine, because the way this thing works is like an electromagnet. That is why, like I've shown in this video, your alternator requires an initial DC power from the battery in order for it to work to magnetize the rotor. Once it starts turning, it becomes self-sufficient. Like I've said, because this rotor is magnetized, it requires force to turn it. And the more electrical component you use or you turn on, the more the rotor magnetizes in order to supply more electricity, and that is what the voltage regulator is for. I'll show you again, okay? And we will see the engine RPM go down. Okay, so let's do that now. As you can see, the idle even increased. It's already 990, close to 1000 RPM, because the engine is already warmed up now. So let's start turning on our electrical components now. Let's start with the lights, headlights, auxiliary lights. Okay, let's start with our AC. Let's turn on the AC, not just the fan, okay? I'm going to turn off the AC compressor, just the fan. Let's turn on our radio. Okay, how about let's turn on the wipers. So I turn them off one by one. Turn off the auxiliary lights, turn off the headlights and the park lights. So you see, the more electrical component you use, the more fuel you consume. And this is also why should you install additional electrical components in your vehicle like a secondary blower or auxiliary lights or anything that requires a lot of electricity, you need to replace your alternator with a higher ampere rating. Otherwise, your alternator would not be able to keep up with all the electrical demands, and you end up with a discharged battery because you are consuming more energy than the alternator can actually provide. Or you end up with a broken alternator because you have overworked it. Or perhaps you end up with both, a broken alternator and a discharged battery. Now, I think you already know that the hydraulic pump also applies a lot of parasitic effect on the engine. And it becomes more evident every time you turn the wheel. Because the hydraulic pump is helping you turn the tires, it is going to get that energy from the engine. I'll show you again, okay? So I will turn the wheel and watch the RPM go down. I'll do that slowly. Okay, so you see that is again a parasitic effect or a parasitic load. One last parasitic load that I would like to make mention is the manual transmission. Now, when you are not stepping on the clutch, the engine and the transmission is constantly engaged. The transmission, even though the gear is in neutral, is still turning with the engine, applying additional weight for the engine to turn. Consequently, also causing a parasitic effect on the engine. That is why if you want to have the engine start easier, step on the clutch because that will disengage the transmission, no additional weight for the engine to turn, hence the engine becomes easier to crank start. See? So anyway, those are examples of parasitic effect or parasitic load. There are other more examples like the weight of the axles, the shaft, the supercharger as opposed to a turbocharger, but maybe I'll make a separate video with regard to that. But generally, that is what parasitic load is. Any load that is applied to the engine that causes a burden for it to work efficiently is a parasitic load. So all in all, I do believe that's it for this topic. I hope you get the general idea. I just want to remind you, okay, or to inform you if you're new to my channel, that I'm not an engineer, nor am I a mechanic or an auto electrician. I'm just a DIY enthusiast. But if you like this video, let me know in the comments below. Like, share, subscribe if you want to. Only if you want to, and as always, thank you for watching.